Dr. Einstein, I know that you seldom give interviews, and so I want to thank you on behalf of all of our listeners for coming here today. I'm sure that what you have to say will be of real interest and service to your new country.
It is clear to me that it was a self-evident duty to accept this invitation. Though I must tell you that I do not think words alone will solve humanity's present problems. The sound of bombs drowns out man's voices. In ordinary times of peace, I have great faith in the communication of ideas between thinking men. But today I am afraid the intellectual way to appeal to man is fast becoming of little avail, with broad force dominating so many millions' lives. 7 years ago, Mr. Dimmock, when asked for the reason why I have given up my position in Germany, I made this statement: as long as I have any choice, I will only stay in a country where political liberty, toleration, and equality of all citizens before the law is the rule. Political liberty implies liberty to express one's political opinion orally and in writing, and a tolerant respect for any and every individual opinion. Making allowance for human imperfection, I do feel that in America the most valuable thing in life is possible: the development of the individual and his creative powers. There may be men who can live without political rights and without opportunity of free individual development. But I think that this is intolerable for most Americans. Here, for generations, men have never been under the humiliating necessity of unquestioning obedience. Here, human dignity has been developed to such a point that it would be impossible for people to endure life under a system in which the individual is only a slave of the state and has no voice in his government and no decision on his own way of life. I think from what I have seen of Americans since I have come here, they are not suited by temperament or tradition for existence under a totalitarian system. I think that most of them would not find life worth living so. Therefore, it is very important that they consider how these liberties that are so necessary to them may be preserved and defended. I am glad to hear you say that Americans can cooperate because nothing truly valuable can be achieved except by the unselfish cooperation of many individuals. Science has provided the possibility of liberation for human beings from hard labor, but science itself is not a liberator. It creates means, not goals. Man should use them for reasonable goals. When the ideals of humanity are war and conquest, those tools become as dangerous as a razor in the hands of a child of 3. We must not condemn man's inventiveness and patient conquest of the forces of nature because they are being used wrongly and destructively now. The fate of humanity is entirely dependent upon its moral development. I think it is quite understandable. Scientists and artists, through their works, frequently have had enduring influence even in the realm of politics. But in order to influence the course of political events directly, one must also have the gift to influence people and their actions directly. This is rather a matter of arousing and using emotions and personal confidence than of clear understanding of causal connections. For this reason, intellectuals have little chance to impress an audience. Also, they usually do not have the gift to make decisions swiftly. Among the outstanding American statesmen, Woodrow Wilson is perhaps the truest example of the intellectual type. But he too did not seem to have mastered the art of dealing with man. His greatest achievement, the League of Nations, appears today as a failure on superficial observation. But in spite of the mutilation of his contemporaries and the boycott of his fellow countrymen, Wilson's work, in my opinion, will be recreated in a more powerful form. Then only will the importance of this great innovator be fully recognized. I am convinced that a federal organization of the nations of the world is not only possible, but even an absolute necessity if the conditions of our planet are not to become unbearable for man. The League of Nations failed because its members were not willing to give up a part of their rights of sovereignty, and because the League was without any executive power. A world organization cannot ensure peace effectively unless it has control over the whole military power of its members. Exaggerated nationalism is an artificially created emotional state resulting from the necessity to be prepared for war. This exaggerated nationalism would quickly disappear with the elimination of the war danger. I do not believe that the unequal geographical distribution of raw materials must necessarily lead to war. As long as a nation has access to the materials which are necessary for its development, it can very well prosper. This is clearly shown by nations such as Switzerland, Finland, Denmark and Norway, which belonged to the most prosperous countries of Europe before the war. One of the most important functions of such an international organization would be to secure unhampered distribution of the raw materials and free access to markets. The solution of the internal economical and social problems could be left largely to the individual states. I am far from being optimistic. What I have told you is not a prophecy, but a statement of what must be done to prevent life on this earth from becoming unbearable. Everybody will agree that we are now far removed from this goal than seemed to be the case 10 years ago. This setback could have been avoided if the democracies had then shown the same solidarity and readiness for sacrifice they have shown now in this hour of great emergency. Will to sacrifice, solidarity and wise foresight, however, are most effective before the hour of dire necessity has arrived. I believe that America will prove that democracy is not merely a form of government bound to a good constitution, but also a way of life supported by a people who have a good tradition, a tradition of moral strength. And the fate of the human race is more than ever dependent on its moral strength today. It followed from the special theory of relativity that mass and energy are but different manifestations of the same thing. a somewhat unfamiliar conception for the average mind. Furthermore, the equation E is equal mc square, in which energy is put equal to mass multiplied with the square of the velocity of light, showed that very small amount of mass may be converted into a very large amount of energy, and vice versa. The mass and energy were in fact equivalent, according to the formula mentioned above. This was demonstrated by Kokra and Walton in 1932 experimentally.
They are a very mixed lot, and when we drink their milk and make distinctions, we have to be guilty of scandalous suppression and disgraceful hypocrisy. There is always a great deal to conceal. If you take the typical great man of our historic epoch, and suppose that I had to rise here tonight to propose the toast of Napoleon, well, undoubtedly I could say many very flattering things about Napoleon. But the one thing which I should not be able to say about him would be perhaps the most important thing. And that was that it would perhaps have been better for the human race if he had never been born. Well, tonight at least, perhaps it will be for the only time in our lives, we have no suppressions to make, no hypocrisy to be guilty of. I have said that great men are a mixed lot, but there are orders of great men. There are great men who are great men among small men, but there are also great men who are great among great men. And that is the sort of great man whom you have amongst you here tonight. Napoleon and other great men of his type, they were makers of empires. But there is an order of men who get beyond that. They are not makers of empires, but they are makers of universes. And when they have made those universes, their hands are unstained by the blood of any human being on earth. They are very rare. I go back 2,500 years. And how many of them can I count in that period? I can count them on the fingers of my two hands. Pythagoras, Ptolemy, Aristotle, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Einstein. And I still have two fingers left vacant. Since the death of Newton, 300 years have passed, 9 generations of men, and those 9 generations of men have not enjoyed the privilege which we are enjoying here tonight. Standing face to face with one of those 8 great men, and looking forward to the privilege of hearing his voice. And another 300 years may very well pass before another generation will enjoy that privilege. And I must, even amongst those 8 men, I must even make a distinction. I have called them makers of universes, but some of them were only repairers of universes. Only 3 of them made universes. These great men, they have been the leaders of one side of a great movement of humanity which has 2 sides. We call the one side religion, and we call the other science. Now religion is always right. Religion solves every problem, and thereby abolishes problems from the universe. Because when you have solved the problem no longer exists. Religion gives us certainty, stability, peace. It gives us absolute, which we so long for. It protects us against that progress which we all dread, almost more than anything else. Science is the very opposite of that. Science is always wrong, and science never solves a problem without raising 10 more problems with all these great men. What have they been doing? Ptolemy, as I say, created the universe. Copernicus proved that Ptolemy was wrong. Kepler proved that Copernicus was wrong. Galileo proved that Aristotle was wrong. And now, you're expecting me to say that Newton proved that they were all wrong. But you forget, when science reached Newton, science came up against that incalculable, that illogical, that hopelessly inconsequent and extraordinary natural phenomenon, an Englishman. That had never happened to it before. As an Englishman, Newton was able to combine mental power so extraordinary that if I were speaking 50 years ago, as I am old enough to have done, I should have said that his was the greatest mind that any man had ever been endowed with. And he contrived to combine the exercise of that wonderful mind with credulity, with superstition, with delusion, which would not have imposed on a moderately intelligent rabbit. As an Englishman also, he knew his people, he knew his language, he knew his own soul. And knowing that language, he knew that an honest thing was a square thing. An honest bargain was a square deal. An honest man was a square man who acted on the square. That is to say, the universe that he created had above everything to be a rectilinear universe. Now, see the dilemma in which this placed Newton. He knew his universe. He knew that it consisted of heavenly bodies all in motion. And he also knew that the one thing that you cannot do to any body in motion whatsoever is to make it move in a straight line. You may fire it out of a cannon with the strongest charge that you can put into it. You may have the cannon contrived to have, as they say, the flattest trajectory. He invented a force which would make the straight lines, take the straight lines of his universe and bend them. And that was the force of gravitation. And when he had invented this force, he had created a universe which was wonderful and consistent in itself, and which was thoroughly British. And when, applying his wonderful genius, when he had completed the book of that universe, what sort of book was it? It was a book which told you the station of all the heavenly bodies. It showed their distances apart. It showed the rate at which they were traveling. It gave you the exact hour at which they would arrive at such and such a point to make an eclipse, or in which they would strike this earth and knock it into bits, as Sirius is going to do someday. In other words, it was not a magical, marvelous thing like a Bible. It was a matter-of-fact British thing like a Bradshaw. for 300 years, we believed in that Bradshaw and in that Newtonian universe, as I suppose no system has ever been believed in before. The more civilized, the more educated we were, the more firmly would we believe. I believed in it. I was brought up to it. Then, an amazing thing happened. A young professor got up in the middle of the audience and, without betraying any consciousness of saying anything extraordinary, he addressed himself to our astronomer and he said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but if you will attentively observe the next eclipse of the sun, you will find out what is wrong with the perihelion of Mercury." And all Europe staggered. They said, something wrong in the Newtonian universe? How can that be? And he said, this man is a blasphemer. Burn him alive. Confute him. Smash. But the astronomers only looked rather foolish. And they said, oh, let us wait for the eclipse. But he said, no, this is not a question of the eclipse. This man has said that there's something wrong with the perihelion of Mercury. Do you mean to say that there is something wrong with the perihelion of Mercury? And then they said, oh yes, we knew it all along. They said Newton knew it. And we said, then why didn't you tell us so before? Our faith began to shake. And we said, if this young man, when the eclipse comes, gets away with it, then the next thing that he will be doing, he will be questioning the existence of gravitation. And the young professor smiled and said, no, I mean no harm to gravitation. Gravitation is a very useful hypothesis. And after all, it gives you fairly close results.
The common language of science. The first step towards language was to link acoustically or otherwise commutable signs to sense impressions. Most likely, all sociable animals have arrived at this primitive kind of communication, at least to a certain degree. A higher development is reached when further signs are introduced and understood which establish relations between those other signs designating sense impressions. At this stage, it is already possible to report somewhat complex series of impressions. We can say that language has come to existence. If language is to lead at all to understanding, there must be rules concerning the relations between the signs on the one hand, and on the other hand there must be a stable correspondence between signs and impressions. In their childhood, individuals connected by the same language grasp these rules and relations mainly by intuition. When man becomes conscious of the rules concerning the relations between signs, the so-called grammar of language is established. In an early stage, the words may correspond directly to impressions. At a later stage, this direct connection is lost in as far as some words convey relations to perceptions only if used in connection with other words. For instance, such words as is, or, think. 10 word groups rather, 10 single words refer to perceptions. When language becomes thus partially independent from the background of impressions, a greater inner coherence is gained. Only at this further development, where frequent use is made of so-called abstract concepts, language becomes an instrument of reasoning in the true sense of the word. But it is also this development which turns language into a dangerous source of error and deception. Everything depends on the degree to which words and word combinations correspond to the world of impression. What is it that brings about such an intimate connection between language and thinking? Is there no thinking without the use of language, namely in concepts and concept combinations, for which words need not necessarily come to mind? Has not every one of us struggled for words, although the connection between things was already clear? We might be inclined to attribute to the act of thinking complete independence from language, if the individual formed or were able to form his concepts without the verbal guidance of his environment. Yet most likely the mental shape of an individual growing up under such conditions would be very poor. Thus we may conclude that the mental development of the individual and his way of forming concepts depend to a high degree upon language. This makes us realize to what extent the same language means the same mentality. In this sense, thinking and language are linked together. What distinguishes the language of science from language as we ordinarily understand the world? How is it that scientific language is international? What science strives for is an utmost preciseness and clarity of concepts as regards their mutual relation and their correspondence to sensory data. As an illustration, let us take the language of Euclidean geometry and algebra. They manipulate with a small number of independently introduced concepts, respectively symbols, such as the integral number, the straight line, the point, as well as with signs which designate the fundamental operations, that is, the connections between those fundamental concepts. This is the basis for the construction, respectively definition, of all other statements and concepts. The connection between concepts and statements on the one hand, and the sensory data on the other hand, is established through acts of counting and measuring, whose performance is sufficiently well determined. The supranational character of scientific concepts and scientific language is due to the fact that they have been set up by the best brains of all countries and all times. In solitude and yet in cooperative effort as regards the final effect, they created the spiritual tools for the technical revolution which have transformed the life of mankind in the last centuries. Their system of concepts have served as a guide in the bewildering chaos of perceptions, so that we learn to grasp general truths from particular observations. What hopes and fears does the scientific method imply for mankind? I do not think that this is the right way to put the question. Whatever this tool in the hand of man will produce depends entirely on the nature of the goals alive in this mankind. Once these goals exist, the scientific method furnishes means to realize them. Yet it cannot furnish the very goals. The scientific method itself would not have led anywhere. It would not even have been born without a passionate striving for clear understanding. Perfections of means and confusion of goals seem, in my opinion, to characterize our age. If we desire sincerely and passionately the safety, the welfare, and the free development of the talents of all men, we shall not be in want of the means to approach such a state. Even if only a smaller part of mankind strives for such goals, their superiority will prove itself in the long run.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Nobel Universalis celebration takes on a special significance this year, when after a deadly struggle of many years, we are at peace again, or what we are supposed to consider as peace. And it bears a still more significance for the physicists who, in one way or another, were connected with the construction or the use of the atomic bomb. For these physicists find themselves in a position not unlike to that of Alfred Nobel himself. Alfred Nobel invented the most powerful explosive ever known up to his time, a means of destruction par excellence. In order to atone for this, in order to relieve his human conscience, he instituted his awards for the promotion of peace and for achievements of peace. Today, the physicists who participated in forging the most formidable and dangerous weapon of all time are harassed by an equal feeling of responsibility, not to say guilt. We cannot desist from warning, and warning again. We cannot and should not slacken in our efforts to make the nations of the world, and especially their governments, aware of the unspeakable disaster they are certain to provoke, unless they change their attitude toward each other and towards the task of shaping the future. We helped in creating this new weapon in order to prevent the enemies of mankind from achieving it ahead of us, which, given the mentality of the Nazis, would have meant inconceivable destruction and the enslavement of the rest of the world. We delivered this weapon into the hands of the Americans and the British people as prestige of the whole mankind, as fighters for peace and liberty. But so far, we fail to see any guarantee of peace. We do not see any guarantee of the freedoms that were promised to the nations in the Atlantic Charter. The war is won, but the peace is not. The great powers, united in fighting, are now divided over the peace settlements. The world was promised freedom from fear, but in fact, fear has increased tremendously since the termination of the war. The world was promised freedom from want, but large parts of the world are faced with starvation, while others are living in abundance. The nations were promised liberation and justice, But we have witnessed and are witnessing even now the sad spectacle of liberating armies firing into populations who want their independence and social equality, and supporting in those countries by force of arms such parties and personalities as appear to be most suited to serve vested interests. Territorial questions and arguments of power, obsolete though they are, still prevail over the essential demands of common welfare and justice. Allow me to be more specific about just one case, which is but a symptom of the general situation, the case of my own people, the Jewish people. As long as Nazi violence was unleashed only, or mainly, against the Jews, the rest of the world looked on passively, and even treaties and agreements were made with the patently criminal government of the Third Reich. Later, when Hitler was on the point of taking over Romania and Hungary, at the time when Majdanek and Oswiecim were in Allied hands, and the methods of the gas chambers were well known all over the world, all attempts to rescue the Romanian and Hungarian Jews came to naught because the doors of Palestine were closed to Jewish immigrants, and no country could be found that would admit those forsaken people. They were left to perish like their brothers and sisters in the occupied countries. We shall never forget the heroic efforts of the small countries, of the Scandinavian, the Dutch, the Swiss nations, and of individuals in the occupied parts of Europe who did all in their power to protect Jewish lives. We do not forget the human attitude of the Soviet Union, who was the only one among the big powers to open her doors to hundreds of thousands of Jews when the Nazi armies were advancing in Poland. But after all that had happened, and was not prevented from happening, how is it today? While in Europe territories are being distributed without any qualms about the wishes of the people concerned, the remainders of European Jewry, 1/5 of its pre-war population, are again denied access to their heaven in Palestine and left to hunger and cold and persisting hostility. There is no country even today that would be willing or able to offer them a place where they could live in peace and security. And the fact that many of them are still kept in degrading conditions of concentration camps by the Allies gives sufficient evidence of the shamefulness and hopelessness of the situation. These people are forbidden to enter Palestine with reference to the principle of democracy. But actually, the Western powers in upholding the ban of the white paper are yielding to the threats and the external pressure of 5 vast and underpopulated Arab states. It is sheer irony when the British Foreign Minister tells the poor lot of European Jews they should remain in Europe because their genius is needed there, and, on the other hand, advises them not to try to get at the head of the queue, lest they might incur new hatred and persecution. Well, I am afraid they cannot help it. With their 6 million dead, they have been pushed at the head of the queue of Nazi victims, most against their will. The picture of our post-war world is not bright. As far as we, the physicists, are concerned, we are no politicians, and it has never been our wish to meddle in politics. But we know of few things that the politicians do not know, and we feel the duty to speak up and to remind those responsible that there is no escape into easy comfort. There is no distance ahead for proceeding little by little and delaying the necessary changes into an indefinite future. There is no time left for petty bargaining. The situation calls for a courageous effort, for a radical change in our whole attitude, in the entire political concept. May the spirit that prompted Alfred Nobel to create this great institution, the spirit of trust and confidence, of generosity and brotherhood among men, prevail in the minds of those upon whose decisions our destiny rests. Otherwise, our civilization will be doomed.